Chapter 18 Friday, June 28th, 1776. Received information that a most horrid plot was on foot by the vile Tories of this place, to assassinate His Excellency and the other general officers, blow up the gunpowder magazine, spike the cannon, etc. Hope they will receive the punishment due such infamous wretches. Journal of Samuel B. Webb, Washington's aide-de-camp. Shortly after the clock struck 10 on Friday morning, thousands of boots echoed against the cobblestones of Broadway. Every soldier in New York was marching up Island to attend the hanging of Thomas Hickey, the man who almost assassinated General George Washington. Becky urged me to go. There's nothing like a good hanging, is there? She gave the face of the grandfather clock another swipe with the dust rag. Keep an eye on your sister, though. Little ones disappear in big crowds. What about Madame? I asked. Nothing to worry about there, eh? Becky pointed upstairs, where Madame lay atop the coverlet on her bed, asleep. She had stayed muddy in strong wine since Lockton fled the city. The thought of a hanging turned my belly, but Colonel Reagan would likely be there. Perhaps he would provide an escort for Ruth and me direct from the gallows to the wharf. Go on, Becky said again. It will be good for you to get some air. Fetch a bucket of water home with you. Mind, I wager Madame will wake with a thumping headache. Ruth and I found ourselves in a tide of people moving north. The wave spread out once it reached the commons, where the prison, the barracks, and a large sugar house stood. Beyond the hills to the north lay the African burial ground, and beyond that the big pond called the Collect. This was the one spot in the city where 20,000 folk could gather. I could scarce credit the number, but it was on everyone's lips. Ruth watched the crowd with big eyes and shy smiles for strangers, but she did not release my hand and kept her doll baby clutched tight to her. I half expected to see vendors selling cinnamon water, boiled sweets, and currant cakes, and a conjure man who could juggle 2 balls in a stool. There were none in sight, but the air of high spirits made it feel like a fair day. I took Ruth by the hand and led her around the backside of Bridewell Prison toward the tea-water pump, where there were other slaves and servants gathered. I nodded polite and murmured my good day to the old man we called grandfather and the others who were familiar. Ruth sat in the dust. I turned our bucket upside down, sat on it, pulled a length of string from my pocket, and wove it into a fanciful pattern around my fingers. Catch cradle, Ruth said, clapping her hands. We lost ourselves in play, our fingers making candles, triangles, diamonds, and the manger. Suddenly, there came a rough shout from the center of the commons. The crowd muttered, some folks craning their necks to see. Ruth giggled and held out her hands to me. She made a complete mishmash of the string and could not untangle her fingers from the knot. There came another shout. Then the drummers started beating their snares. The noise crackled like lightning. Game's over, I said to Ruth, freeing her hands and pulling her to her feet. The crowd surrounding the commons had swelled to include the entire army and every soul in the city except for Madame and Becky. I scanned the rows of officers lined up behind the gallows, looking for Colonel Reagan. I could pick out General Washington astride his big gray horse at the center of the line. Next to him was the rather large figure of Colonel Knox and countless other officers I could not name. Colonel Reagan was not to be seen, but he could have been rows to the back. Blast! I should have realized they would be in formation, not scattered amongst the common folk. Another shouted order echoed off the stone front of the prison. Near 100 soldiers stepped out of the ranks and snapped to attention. The bayonets fixed to the end of their long muskets flashed in the sun. The drummers continued beating, sweat trickling down their faces. Bet you never saw this out in the country, a familiar voice said in my ear. I whirled with a gasp. Curzon laughed at my astonishment. Miss me? He asked. What are you doing here? Where have you been? I asked, fighting to keep my voice low. Much is afoot. He nodded, his head toward the gallows. So I see. I opened my mouth to ask the first of 1,000 questions, but he quickly put a finger to his lips. Shh, he warned. Ruth put his arms in the air and grunted. She was tired of staring at the backsides of people crowding around us. I shook my head. You're too big to pick up. No, she's not. Before I could protest, Curzon tossed his ridiculous head at me and lifted Ruth up to perch on his left shoulder. She squealed with delight and a little fear and hung on to his neck so tightly he looked to choke. I glanced at the red hat in my hands. A name was written on a scrap of fabric affixed to the crown, James. James, I wondered aloud. If he heard me, Curzon took no notice. His eyes raked the crowd, looked intently, but giving no clue about what he sought. I cut my hand to my mouth and whispered in his ear, When will they send for Ruth and me? Colonel Reagan promised to help. The world turns upside down every day. He kept his eyes straight ahead and one hand on Ruth's back to hold her steady. "The time will come, you'll see." The drums beat faster. My heart sped up to match the rhythm. The drums stopped. "Here he comes," someone called. A guard marched Hickey out of the prison and across the yard to the gallows, his uniform dirty but buttoned. He kept his eyes on the steps that led up to the platform. He did not look at the rope that awaited him. The crowd had recovered its voice and was screaming vile curses. Cabbages, rotten apples, and a dead cat were thrown in the direction of the traitor. He flinched as an egg sailed past his nose, but the men holding his elbows kept their backs straight and their boots marching forward. Hickey was halted in front of the captain of the guard. The captain said something that we couldn't hear, then he pulled the sword from his scabbard and sliced the epaulets off Hickey's shoulders. He folded them and placed them in his pocket, then brought the sword down in a sweep across the front of Hickey's chest, neatly slicing off the buttons from the traitor's coat. The buttons fell one by one into the dust. Ruth stopped giggling. A preacher stepped out of the crowd and approached Hickey, a Bible in his hand. The captain nodded curtly at the preacher and said something else to Hickey, again too low for us to hear. Hickey said nothing, but he had started to tremble. The captain spat on Hickey's boots, took one step back, and slid his sword home into the scabbard. The preacher murmured to Hickey and got no response, so took him by the hand and led him to the wooden stairs that led up to his fate. "He's crying," I said. "Good," Curzon said. When he got to the top of the steps, Hickey turned around so the hangman could bind his wrists behind him. The drummers started beating their snares again, louder than before. The aide on horseback next to General Washington spoke, and the general leaned forward to hear better. He was by far the tallest man in sight. He agreed with whatever the aide said and patted his horse's neck. The animal tossed his mane and pawed at the ground. The crowd had grown so loud that Ruth released Curzon's neck and covered her ears with her hands. She whimpered once. I held out my arms and she slid into them. I lowered her to the ground. She stood near on top of my shoes, grasped my apron, and stuck her thumb in her mouth. The hangman led Hickey to the center of the platform. He placed the knotted noose around Hickey's neck, tightened it, then helped him climb onto an upright barrel. The captain of the guard raised his hand. The drumming stopped. The crowd fell still. The captain of the guard unrolled the sheet of paper and read the charges in a loud voice. "Thomas Hickey, you have been court-martiated and found guilty of the capital crime of mutiny and sedition, of holding a treacherous correspondence with, and receiving pay from, the enemy for the most horrid and detestable purposes, and you have been sentenced to hang from the neck until dead. You are a disgrace to your country." He rolled the paper back up. "May God have mercy on your soul." With that pronouncement, the hangman kicked the barrel away. The crowd gasped. I covered Ruth's eyes with my hands and closed my own. Chapter 19, Sunday, June 30th, through Monday, July 1st, 1776. Sir, we have been too long deaf. We have too long shown our forbearance and long suffering. Our thunders must go forth. America must be conquered. Alexander Wedderburn, Solicitor General of England, to George III, King of England. Most heartily we beseech thee, with thy favour, to behold our most gracious sovereign Lord King George, and to replenish him with the grace of thy Holy Spirit. The minister paused to draw breath, and bless our gracious Queen Charlotte, their Royal Highness, George Prince of Wales, the Princess Dowager of Wales, and all the royal family. The Reverend had so much beseeching to do for the royal family, I thought we'd be stuck in church for a week. Trinity was an Anglican church, filled with prayers for England, burning incense, and ministers in fancy dress. It discommoded me to attend, but Madame gave me no choice. At home we went to the Congregational Church, with 10 pews, windows that looked out on the ocean, and a preacher who always wore black. I liked it better. Incense made me sneeze. We humbly beseech. They did a pack of beseeching at Trinity. The church was more than half empty, compared to the first. Sunday Madame brought us, what with so many folks melting into the countryside like Master Lockton. Martha Washington and her ladies were north on the island, and those left in the pews were loyalist. This made matters easier for the Reverend, who could pray the way he wanted without worry of insulting men who owned the rebel cannons. Ruth bounced her cornhusk doll in her lap and flew it through the air. Some folk grumbled about servants and slaves being forced to sit in the upstairs gallery. To my mind, being in the upstairs meant we were closer to God, and our prayers got there first. Besides, nobody upstairs fussed when Ruth played on the floor. Lighten our darkness, we beseech thee, O Lord, and by the great mercy defend us from all perils and dangers. I beseech thee, O Lord, by thy great mercy take us home. By the hand of Colonial Reagan take us home. In all thy glory take us home. Ad Astra, ad Astra, ad Astra. Ruth tugged on my skirt. It was time to stand up again and pray. Below us, Madame leaned against the sturdy figure of Lady Seymour, who had come to the house early and forced Madame out of bed and into a Sunday dress. She covered the bruises still visible on Madame's face with a thick white layer of Molyneux Italian paste, and told her she must not show weakness. We sat down again, up, down, up, down. Young minister would never make up his mind. My belly grumbled. Good thing the service was drawing to a close. Just a little more beseeching, a few amens, and we'd head home for cold pigeon pie and sour pickles. Ruth's fingers drifted to her nose for some unsightly digging. As I reached for her hand, the front door of the church slammed open with a thud. The Reverend near fainted with surprise. A young boy ran halfway down the center aisle. "Begging pardon, Reverend," he shouted, "but the British have sailed into the harbor." The British army was hardly marching down Wall Street, but 10 ships had docked downriver on Staten Island. Ruth and me followed behind Madame and Lady Seymour as we strode with the crowd to the Battery as fast as our skirts would allow. Madame quivered with excitement, but was wise enough not to say a word, for we found ourselves in a crowd of rebels furious about the arrival of King George's boys. Someone fired a cannon a stone's throw from where we stood. Gunpowder smoke drifted across the crowd as soldiers started running every which way, carrying on about orders this and orders that. Someone fired a musket and a woman shrieked. 2 more muskets blasted. Rough voices commanded the firing to cease. Mothers chased after their children. 5 men in frontier leggings and leather shirts sprinted past us, rifles at the ready. Should I grab Ruth and run for the barracks? Could we slip away to sanctuary in the commotion? I looked for Colonial Reagan, but saw of him not. None of the men were familiar to me. Had I waited too long? The cannons fired once more, then fell silent. The ships were too far away to be hit, and the cannonballs fell into the river. Another musket cracked fire, but this was more distant. The crowd had settled some, and the soldiers were lining up in orderly fashion. Thanks to their barking officers. Everyone please disperse, shouted a broad-shouldered man in a crisp blue coat and a sleek, freshly powdered wig. There is no danger here, but go about your business. Come now, Madame said. We will leave this rabble. She walked away with Lady Seymour. I went to follow them, but Ruth would not move. She stood rooted to the ground, trembling against my leg as if a gale were blowing. Ruthie, I patted her back. It's over now. The noise is gone. No more bangs. I reached to pry her fingers from me. They were stiff and shaking. She was in the grip of a fit, a small one. Oh, Lord, I beseech thee. Madame had stopped and was watching us. Come along, girl, she snapped. Turn your sister loose and run ahead to prepare the meal. Ruth quivered, her teeth chattering in her head. She's a wee bit frightened, ma'am, I explained. Never heard a cannon go off before. Neither have I, added Lady Seymour. She'll feel better when she starts to walk. Please, Lord. Hear what Mrs. said, Ruth? Walking is the best thing. Please keep her on her feet. Please make it stop. We've work to do, baby girl. My voice was as false as my smile. Please. I stepped forward, pushing Ruth ahead as I went. The trembling stopped, but her body went limp. I picked her up and settled her on my hip, her head on my shoulder, as if she had fallen asleep. Lady Seymour frowned in concern. Is she poorly? Madame cast a suspicious eye at us. No, ma'am, I lied. Just tired. She's not suffering her particular ailment, is she? Madame asked, her voice cutting like a blade. No, ma'am, I lied again. She helped carry out the ashes this morning, and I tired her. Madame glared a moment longer. Lady Seymour stepped in front of Madame. The heat affects small children more than most. Make sure your sister drinks some water before any more chores. Yes, ma'am. Thank you, ma'am. I bobbed a clumsy curtsy and walked as fast as I could with the limp burden in my arms, beseeching with every step. British ships continued to sail up the river all the day and all the night. Madame set us to polishing the silver in the hope that we'd soon be serving dinner to the British High Command. On Monday morning, Becky sent me to the washerwoman with a giant basket of dirty tablecloths and serviettes. So many ships had arrived by then, hundreds, folks said, with thousands of soldiers, that we could see the patches of white sail far down the harbor. The washerwoman's home stood empty. A neighbor said she had fled at first light, terrified at the thought of invasion. She wasn't the only one. I carried the basket of linen back to the house on Wall Street, put a pot of water over the fire, and gathered the soap and the scrubbing board. Becky was off in search of a seamstress, so Ruth helped me haul the water to the washtub in the backyard. I gave her a small bucket and a sliver of soap, and she got to work washing a pair of stockings and singing to herself. She showed no ill effects of the small fit at the Battery. It had been a brief shower, not a thunderstorm. As I scrubbed, my mind ran in circles, like a dog chasing its tail. I should take Ruth and march down to the Battery. I should demand payment for helping with the arrest. No demands. I should politely ask the colonial to fulfill his promise as a gentleman would. I should write a letter to the general. I should beg Curzon to beg Mr. Bellingham to beg whoever to get us out. I flopped the tablecloth into the rinse tub and started in on a shift that had gotten mixed in with the table linens. Ruth dropped her stockings in the rinse bucket and loaded her bucket with rocks. We don't wash rocks, Ruth, I explained. But they're dirty, she said. That is the truth, I said. The rocks were dirty, and washing them kept her calm and away from Madam. Scrub away, lass. There was no use in begging anyone. The chances of them listening to me were as good as a snowball's chance in the devil's bake oven. I reached for the soap as Ruth flung her half-washed rocks, now muddy, not dirty, into the rinsing tub with the clean tablecloth. Before I could scold her, the back door slammed. I saw a flash of a yellow gown by the kitchen window. Madam had been watching us, no doubt displeased that Ruth was washing rocks with the tablecloths. We must escape. Soon. Chapter 20, Tuesday, July 2nd through Tuesday, July 9th, 1776. The Congress have judged it necessary to dissolve the connection between Great Britain and the American colonies, and to declare them free and independent states. As you will perceive by the enclosed declaration, I am directed to request you have it proclaimed at the head of the army in the way you shall think most proper. Letter from John Hancock, President of the Continental Congress, to General George Washington. That week unspooled slowly with hot days and muggy, breathless nights. Militia units from the surrounding colonies piled into the city. Ordinary folks skedaddled out of it as fast as their horse or feet would carry them. The extra soldiers were not the cleanest sort, or maybe they were too busy drilling and making gunpowder cartridges to wash. Whatever the cause, New York soon smelled like a garbage pit, mixed with a fresh mountain of manure. The stench cooked under the midsummer sun. Madam's moods changed with the tide. One moment she floated on clouds of fancy, imagining her grand life once the British beat the rebels. Next, she fell into melancholy, grumbling about the lazy British commanders floating at the anchor off Staten Island, observing New York through long spyglasses, but making no move to invade. She now carried with her a brocade pouch suspended from a red satin cord. Within the pouch lay a green flask filled with a calming elixir prescribed by the doctor. He advised her to drink from it whenever the need arose. She also took to walking around the house in her stocking feet, trying to catch me unawares as I scrubbed or dusted or polished, often with Ruth at my side. She said nothing during those encounters, but watched us with hungry hawk eyes. It unnerved me. The week after Hickey's hanging, Becky suffered a mild attack of the ague that had befallen so many soldiers. She grew pale and sweaty, but did not require purging or leeches. In her stead, I went to the market. Our needs were fewer now that we no longer fed the master and his companions. 'Twas a good thing, for farmers were afraid to come into the city, and there was less to choose from. More people fled every day, including the wives of General Washington and Colonel Knox and Brigadier Greene, her that the folks said was such a big flirt. I searched for Curzon every day, but Bellingham's affairs kept him out of sight. I was afraid to seek out Colonel Reagan, afraid that would get back to Madam and our lives be put in jeopardy. 10 days after the British flooded the river with their ships, news that the Congress had declared independence arrived in New York. The declaration was read to the troops from the steps of City Hall. The men cheered so loud it seemed to shake the whole island. I hurried from the egg cellar to see the cause of the commotion. The cheering men danced and marched down Broadway, tossing their hats into the air and shouting across the river at the silent ships of England. They gathered into a mob on the Bowling Green around the massive statue of King George III. I stayed at the edge of the crowd, hoping for a glimpse of Curzon or a soldier familiar from my visit to the Battery. The king was mounted on his horse, and the horse mounted on a white marble pedestal that rose to the height of 3 men standing one atop the other. Both the horse and the man were fashioned larger than could be possible, but I suppose that was the way of kings. They were both made of gold that sometimes glittered in the sunlight, but dulled when the clouds interfered. Ropes appeared as if conjured, thick ropes used for tying ships to the docks. The men cheered louder and worked together to throw the ropes over the king and his horse and tie them tightly. 1, 2, 3, heave! 1, 2, 3, heave! The men strained their arms and backs. Boys on the edge of the crowd jumped up and down. Common folk stood froze at the sight of a king being pulled down by the strength of the men working together. 1, 2, 3, heave! The statue toppled slowly at first, then gaining speed, as the weight fell from the sky to the ground. The men scrambled out of the way, no one wishing to be crushed by a fallen king. As it crashed, they shouted even louder and swarmed over the thing. Axes were called for and rushed out of workshops and up from the barracks. A half-dozen men took to chopping the king and his steed to bits. I inched closer. How could they be chopping through a statue with simple axes? A piece of tail broke off, and a soldier held it up for all to see. The king was not made of gold, but of soft lead, covered with gilt paint. The crowd shouted again as another soldier lifted the king's head, freshly removed from his neck. A fifey and drum corps started playing just beyond the mob, piping out the song usually heard during a tar and feathering party. The men made short work of King George. When the statue was reduced into pieces that could easily be crated off, they did just that. The plan was to melt down all the lead into bullets. "We'll fire, Majesty, at the redcoats," joked a man with a booming voice. "Aye," said his companion, shouldering an axe. "Emanations from Leyden George will make deep impressions at the enemy." As the crowd marched off to make bullets and celebrate liberty and independence in the taverns, I realized dark was fast falling and I had tarried over long. I picked up a sliver of the lead that lay in the street. It was fringed with gilt. My own piece of Majesty. Tyrants beware, I thought as I put it in my pocket. I was surprised to see the front parlor windows alight when I walked down Wall Street. "Is the master back?" I asked Becky. She was dozing in the chair by the kitchen fire with a red check shawl around her shoulders, still worn down from her illness. Becky yawned and stretched. "Far from it. Madam paid a call on the Reverend's wife after supper. Came home with high color in her cheeks and a bee in her bonnet. 'Dress the child,' she says. 'Make sure both of the girls eat something nourishing and sweet.'" "Did she fall and hit her head?" I asked, setting down the basket of eggs. Becky laughed. "I think that Mrs. Reverend served her a dose of scripture, the hard kind, Madam says. I've been too harsh on my servants. I must mend my ways or the Lord will punish me." I was confuddled. "She's being kind to Ruth again?" Becky stood slowly, wincing from the aches in her bones. "Surely so. Ruth lit up like a lantern when she saw them fancy clothes again, promised to be quiet as ever, made short work of the gingerbread Madam baked too." This was too much. I sat down at the table. "Madam baked? She's had a fair hand in the kitchen when she puts her mind to it. Left the dishes for yours truly, but the cake was tasty." "Those 2 pieces are for you." She was most firm about it. She stopped to cough up what she sounded like a large wet worm from her throat. "She cooked up sweet milk for you too, with nutmeg, cinnamon, and sugar. Said you was to have some with your gingerbread." I sniffed the pitcher. It smelled good enough. "Did you have any?" "Not with this cough. Milk would stop up my lungs." I looked around the kitchen. "Where's Ruth now?" Becky unpinned her apron and folded it, then tied on her bonnet, preparing to go home. Madam got it in her head to play cards this eve. Has 2 companions in with her, the Mrs. Drinkwater and her daughter, the one who's to marry some sort of lord or duke or some such. Ruth is in with them. She was right cheered after the cake and milk. Should I take anything in? I just come from there. Madam was most definite. Tell Sal to enjoy her cake and night off. She has worked hard these weeks and could do with a good night's sleep. She called me Sal instead of girl, I asked. Are you full certain she didn't hit her head today? Becky laughed, and the laugh caught in her throat and bubbled into a cough. Look here, she's likely to turn back down and enjoy a little peace. I poured a mug of the milk. Huzzah for the Reverend's wife. I wanted to savor the gingerbread bite by bite and sip the milk slowly, but I couldn't help myself. The mug was drained and the plate was empty soon after Becky left. The milk was the sweetest thing I had ever tasted, and the spices so thick I could near chew them. No wonder Ruth was cheered by it. I washed up my dishes, tidied the kitchen, and found myself with idle hands. A rare event indeed. Could sneak into the library and borrow that Crusoe book. I could read by the fire with a mending basket nearby to slip the book into should Madam approach. That seemed a fine plan, but first I wanted to shed my bodice. It pinched something awful under my arms. I felt my way down the cellar stairs with my toes and heard the sound of laughter from Madam's company. I yawned. When would they leave? And what sort of ladies came to call this late? I removed my bodice and hung it on a nail. The pallet looked soothing and cool, and the thought of climbing the stairs again made me weary. But I would like to read a few more pages. But I was overly fatigued. But Mr. Crusoe was facing all sorts of danger. But in betwixt one thought and the next, I fell asleep. For that I shall never forgive myself.